A Millionaire's twins had never taken a single step until the night he walked in and saw their nanny doing something no doctor had ever dared. Was it a miracle or a secret that could change his family forever? Before we dive into this unforgettable journey, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? If stories about love, sacrifice, and second chances speak to your heart, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we're bringing you another powerful story, and heroine will fill your... The glass towers of Drake International stood like cold monuments against the skyline, their steel and mirrored windows reflecting the glow of a city that never slept. Inside the top-floor office, Nicholas Drake sat at his desk, his eyes fixed on a screen filled with numbers, contracts, and market forecasts. To the world, he was a man who had conquered everything, an empire built on precision, control, and relentless ambition. To his children, however, he was a ghost. Nicholas adjusted his cufflinks, a small gesture of habit more than necessity, and ignored the blinking notification on his phone. The message had come from his housekeeper. Another nanny had resigned. That made the seventh in less than a year. He silenced the notification, muttered something under his breath, and turned back to the contracts. Business was something he understood. Spreadsheets and negotiations bent to his will. But his children, they were puzzles he could not solve. At only 5 years old, Eli and Emma were as fragile as porcelain. They had been born with a rare neuromuscular condition that left their small legs weak, unable to carry them farther than a few faltering steps before collapsing. Doctors had filled Nicholas's life with words like therapy, patience, and uncertain prognosis. Words he had no time for. He wanted solutions, not mabes. He wanted a cure, not a... And when no cure came, he withdrew into the only world he could control, his empire. At the Drake estate, the twins waited in silence most evenings, their small faces pressed against the wide windows overlooking the garden. They watched other children through the glass, children of the staff who ran and tumbled across the lawn, their laughter echoing. Eli and Emma could only sit and watch, their fingers twitching against the glass, as though longing to reach out and touch freedom itself. They would turn to look at each other, and in their quiet bond they found companionship no adult seemed to give them. It was not that Nicholas did not care. Somewhere, beneath the armor of his ambition, he loved them fiercely, but grief had twisted his love into silence. Their mother had died shortly after childbirth, a complication that no wealth or doctor could prevent. Nicholas had buried his heart along with her. All he had left were two fragile reminders, children who mirrored her face but carried a condition that mocked his powerlessness. Every time he looked at them, he saw both the woman he had lost and the legacy of what he could not fix. The nannies who came and went always left the same notes. The children are difficult, the father is cold, progress is impossible. Some tried discipline, others tried tenderness, none lasted. The house itself felt like a gilded cage, marble floors, grand staircases, chandeliers sparkling above rooms too large for children who could not walk across them. The twins lived in luxury, yet lacked the one thing that mattered: warmth. One rainy evening, Eli sat in the playroom, clutching a toy car in his hand. He pushed it forward across the carpet, watching the wheels spin freely, wishing his own legs could do the same. Emma sat beside him, her doll resting in her lap. They were quiet children, their voices soft and hesitant, as if afraid to disturb the silence that always lingered in the house. "Do you think Papa will come tonight?" Emma asked, her eyes hopeful. Eli shook his head without looking up. "He's busy." That was the word they had learned to use. Busy meant absent. Busy meant love had to wait. Down the hall, Nicholas stood in the doorway, unseen for a moment. He had returned from the office earlier than usual, paper still in his briefcase, his tie loosened. He watched his children, two small figures huddled together under the dim glow of the chandelier. For a fleeting second, something ached inside him. But then the phone in his pocket buzzed with another deal, another demand, and the moment was gone. He turned away, leaving the twins to their silence. The next morning, Drop Patel, one of the many specialists who had been on retainer, delivered the same tired assessment Nicholas had heard for years. Their progress will be slow, if at all. It is possible with consistent therapy and encouragement, but they require more than just physical exercises. They need emotional presence, stability. Nicholas cut him off with a curt nod. "I'll hire another nanny, someone better." The doctor sighed, knowing it wasn't a matter of staff, it was a matter of fatherhood. Later that week, Interviews were arranged in the estate's library. Women in neat dresses and men with carefully prepared resumes sat across from Nicholas, who scanned their credentials as though he were hiring executives rather than caretakers. Most didn't return after the first day. Some couldn't handle the twins' fragility. Others couldn't handle Nicholas himself, his impossible standards, his cold eyes, his dismissive tone. The staff began whispering that no one would ever last. Meanwhile, the twins felt each new face blur into the next. Names were forgotten almost as quickly as they arrived. Each departure left them a little quieter, a little more withdrawn. Emma began talking to her doll as though it were her confidant. Eli spent more time by the window, watching freedom dance outside while he sat trapped within walls of wealth. One night, Nicholas found himself pacing his office long after midnight. A storm raged outside, lightning cracking across the sky, thunder shaking the windows. He poured himself a drink, staring at the amber liquid as though it could offer answers. For once, he felt the weight of defeat. His empire thrived, but his children were slipping into a world of silence and shadows. He thought of their small hands reaching for him when they were younger, before he had pulled away, before his grief had turned to stone. He had been absent for too long, but he didn't know how to return. The following morning, his assistant placed a file on his desk. "There's one more candidate, sir. She doesn't have the standard credentials, but—" Nicholas raised an eyebrow. "But what?" The assistant hesitated. "She's different, not polished, but I have a feeling she might last." Nicholas glanced at the resume. A single line stood out: experience with children, specialized in adaptive physical care. He set the file aside, unconvinced but desperate enough to try. That evening, while the twins sat quietly in their playroom, Nicholas stared at the rain streaking down the windows once more. For years he had built walls around his family, walls of marble and steel, walls no one could break. Yet with every departing nanny, with every silent dinner, those walls had only grown colder. He didn't know it yet, but the next knock at his door would be the beginning of everything changing. The morning Clara Hayes walked up the stone steps of the Drake estate, the world seemed larger than she was. Her shoes were scuffed from miles of wear, her modest dress clung to her frame in the damp spring air, and her hands shook as the strap of her worn leather bag. She paused at the grand iron doors towering over her like a challenge she wasn't sure she could answer. Behind those doors lived children who had sent away every other name. Behind those doors waited a man with a reputation colder than winter steel. Clara inhaled slowly, her chest tight with both fear and determination. She had faced hardship before: depth, rejection, the quiet shame of failed dreams. Once she had trained as a physical therapist, pouring her soul into helping children with developmental delays. But mistakes in her past and a cascade of bad luck had pushed her out of clinics and into survival jobs. Taking the position of nanny for Nicholas Drake's twins wasn't what she had planned for her life. Yet here she was, because she couldn't afford not to be. The butler opened the door with a polite, if wary, nod. "Miss Hayes?" She nodded, stepping into a hallway of polished marble and hushed grandeur. Her footsteps echoed as though she were trespassing in a cathedral. Every corner of the mansion seemed designed to intimidate. Gold-framed paintings, heavy drapes, and staircases wide enough to hold a parade. Clara felt small, but she reminded herself of why she had come. The job wasn't just a lifeline for her debts. It was a chance, however slim, to prove that her compassion still had value. Nicholas Drake was waiting in the library, seated in a high-backed chair, sunlight streaming through tall windows and outlining his sharp profile. He didn't rise when she entered. He simply glanced up from the folder in his hand, his eyes moving from the resume to the woman standing before him. His expression carried the kind of skepticism that had likely ended 100 negotiations before they began. "Clara Hayes," he said, his voice even, clipped. "No formal certification, no agency recommendation. Spotty employment history." He closed the folder with a quiet snap. "Why should I believe you will succeed where 7 others have failed?" Clara steadied herself. She had expected this. "Because I won't treat Eli and Emma like cases or problems to solve. I'll treat them like children. Children who need more than charts and schedules. They need someone who will see them." Nicholas's gaze lingered on her, unreadable. She wasn't polished like the others he had interviewed. She wasn't rehearsed. There was a softness in her voice that seemed, to him, dangerously naive. Yet there was something else too, a steadiness, a quiet conviction that kept her from faltering under his stare. He leaned back slightly. "You'll find their condition is not improved by sentiment," he said flatly. "They require structure, discipline, and results." Clara met his eyes. "Maybe, but structure won't make them smile. Discipline won't make them believe they're capable of more. Results come when a child feels safe enough to try." The silence stretched, thick with unspoken tension. For the first time in a long time, Nicholas felt someone had dared to push back without trembling. He didn't show it, of course. Instead, he gestured toward the door. "You'll meet them now. If they respond to you, you'll stay. If not, we'll consider this a wasted morning." The playroom was at the far end of the hall, filled with toys that looked barely touched. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, falling across two small figures on the floor. Eli sat with his toy car, rolling it forward and back in slow repetition, while Emma brushed the hair of her doll with careful strokes. Their movements were quiet, almost mechanical, as if even play had become muted by the absence of joy. Clara's heart tightened at the sight. She stepped into the room softly, lowering herself to their level rather than looming over them. "Hello?" she said gently, her voice carrying warmth like a candle in the dark. "You must be Eli and Emma. I'm Clara." The twins looked up cautiously, their eyes wide with the kind of hesitation children learn from disappointment. They had seen many faces come and go, each promising something and leaving too soon. Clara smiled, not forced or grand, but real. She set her bag aside and picked up a small wooden block from the floor, holding it in her palm as though it were a treasure. "Did you know," she whispered conspiratorially, "that this block has a secret? If you listen closely, it can tell you stories about castles and dragons." Emma blinked, curiosity flickering across her face. She leaned closer, her doll forgotten for a moment. Eli's grip on his toy car loosened as his eyes tracked Clara's expression, waiting to see if she was serious. Clara pressed the block to her ear, nodding dramatically. Yes, I hear you," she said, pretending to listen. "The block says it's waiting for a brave knight and a clever princess to build it a home." She placed it gently on the carpet between them. Emma giggled, a sound so rare in that room, it startled even her. Eli glanced at his sister, then back at Clara, his lips twitching upward in the faintest of smiles. Clara didn't push further. She simply stayed, letting them see that she wasn't afraid of their silence. From the doorway, Nicholas observed with his arms crossed. He expected the children to retreat, as they always did with strangers. Instead, he watched Emma scoot a little closer, her doll bumping against Clara's knee. He watched Eli hesitate, then nudge his toy car toward her hand. It wasn't much, but it was more than they had offered anyone in months. Clara looked up, catching Nicholas's gaze for the briefest second. Her eyes said what her lips didn't. They don't need another guard or instructor. They need connection. He turned away before the thought could root itself too deeply. Later that afternoon, Clara was shown to her quarters, a modest suite tucked on the second floor. She placed her few belongings carefully on the dresser, folded clothes, a pair of worn shoes, a single photograph of her younger brother. She touched the frame, her jaw tightening. She hadn't told anyone why she needed this job, why she couldn't afford to fail. The debts she carried, the guilt of mistakes from her past, the people depending on her. These were weights she bore silent. Nicholas Drake didn't need to know. The twins didn't need to know. All they needed was someone who would not walk away. That night, as she tucked Emma's blanket around her shoulders and set Eli's toy car beside his pillow, she felt their small hands brush hers. It was a fleeting touch, tentative but searching. In that fragile moment, Clara made herself a promise. She would stay, no matter how difficult Nicholas Drake made it. She would stay for them. The following morning, Clara rose before the sun. She had always believed in starting early, a habit from her years training in clinics where every minute mattered. She slipped into the quiet hallways of the mansion, the silence pressing down like the weight of marble and memory. When she reached the kitchen, she found the chef already at work, bustling over a pan with an air of practiced efficiency. "Coffee?" he asked gruffly, clearly surprised to see her awake. "Please, thank you," Clara said with a smile. She poured herself a cup, wrapping her fingers around its warmth. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to savor the comfort before remembering her purpose. She wasn't here for comfort. She was here to make a difference. When she entered the playroom, the twins were still sleepy, their hair tousled, their pajamas wrinkled from a night of restless turning. They looked at her with a blend of curiosity and caution, as though unsure if she would still be there. Clara knelt down beside them, her voice soft. "Good morning, Eli. Good morning, Emma. Did you know mornings are when your bodies are strongest? Muscles like to wake up with the sun." Emma tilted her head. "Really?" Clara nodded solemnly. "Really. It's like your legs are little sunflowers. They need stretching to catch the light." She gently guided Emma into a simple stretch, making a game of it, pretending they were flowers opening their petals. Eli watched, reluctant at first, but when Clara made a silly face and declared, "Your sunflower is drooping. Quick, lift it up," he giggled, despite himself, and tried to mimic the motion. To their laughter, light and fragile, carried down the hall. Nicola, on his way to the office, slowed his steps when he heard it. He stood just out of sight, his expression flickering with something unreadable. He hadn't heard laughter like that in the house in years. Yet instead of stepping closer, he adjusted his tie and walked away, burying himself once again in work. Throughout the day, Clara observed more than she acted. She watched how the twins moved, or rather, how they avoided moving. Their arms were strong, their smiles eager when they felt safe, but their legs trembled with every attempt. More than weakness, she saw fear. Fear of falling, fear of failure, born of years being told, even gently, that walking might not be possible. Clara knew that fear intimately. She had lived it in her own way. She pulled out crayons and paper, asking them to draw their dreams. Emma drew a princess in a castle, her dress flowing like a river of pink. Eli drew a racetrack, with cars zooming in bold strokes of red and black. Clara pointed to the stick figures at the bottom. "And who are these?" she asked. "It's us," Emma whispered, almost shy. "We're watching." Clara's throat tightened. She set down her crayon and leaned closer. "What if one day you weren't just watching? What if you were in the picture, running, dancing, racing?" Eli frowned, skeptical. "We can't." Clara smiled gently. "Not yet, but sometimes not yet is very different from never." That night, at dinner, Clara was invited to join the family, at Nicholas's insistence, though it was clear he had done so out of obligation rather than desire. The dining hall stretched endlessly, the polished table gleaming under crystal chandeliers. Nicholas sat at the head, immaculate as always, his gaze more on his wineglass than on conversation. The twins sat halfway down, their plates filled but barely touched. Clara noticed how they looked toward their father, waiting for some acknowledgement that never came. The silence was stifling, heavy with the absence of warmth. Finally, Clara cleared her throat. "Leah told me today he likes cars," she said, her tone bright. "He drew an entire racetrack with colors I didn't even know could go that fast." Eli's face lit up, pride flickering in his eyes as he glanced nervously at his father. Nicholas looked up, one eyebrow arched. "Cars?" Eli said, his voice small but steady. "I like the fast ones." For a brief moment, Nicholas's expression softened, almost imperceptibly. "I used to race model cars when I was your age." His lips curved faintly, but then he caught himself, as though embarrassed by the slip, and he returned his attention to his glass. Clara noticed, and though the moment was fleeting, she held on to it. It was a crack in the armor, small, but there. After dinner, when Nicholas retreated to his study, Clara remained with the twins. They asked her to read a story, their voices tentative, as if unsure they had the right to ask. She chose a tale about a bird with broken wings that learned to soar again. As she read, she glanced at them, noting the way Emma clutched her doll tightly, the way Eli leaned forward, absorbing every word. She closed the book softly and whispered. The twins fell asleep with smiles, their hands still curled around their toys. Clara stayed a while longer, watching them breathe, her heart heavy with the weight of their innocence. She knew this job was more than she had bargained for. It wasn't just about keeping them fed or entertained. It was about fighting for their belief in themselves. The days that followed were filled with small victories. Emma laughed more often, her eyes brighter. Eli allowed Clara to hold his hands as he tried to push himself up, even if only for seconds at a time. Clara turned exercises into games, weaving therapy into stories so they never felt like chores. And with each day, the twins began to trust her more. But not everyone was convinced. Nicholas kept his distance, watching from shadows, his doubt unspoken but palpable. He saw the way Clara knelt in the grass with them, the way she celebrated every minor twitch of progress as though it were a miracle. To him, it looked dangerously like hope, and hope had betrayed him before. One evening, as Clara guided Emma through a playful exercise of pretending to dance with her doll, Nicholas finally spoke. His voice was cool, detached. "You're filling their heads with illusions. They've been told by the best doctors that walking may never happen. Do you think you know better?" Clara turned to face him, her hand still steady on Emma's. Her voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "I don't claim to know better than doctors, but I know children, and I know that if you tell them they can't, they'll believe it forever. If you tell them they might, they'll try." Nicholas' jaw tightened. He looked at Emma, her eyes shining with the simple joy of trying, and then at Eli, who leaned against Clara's side as though he belonged there. For a moment, Nicholas seemed almost shaken, as though he were seeing something he had forgotten existed. He turned away without replying. That night, Clara sat by her window in the small suite upstairs, staring out at the garden. She thought of the debt still looming over her, the mistakes she hadn't confessed, the life she had left behind to take this job. But when she remembered the sound of Emma's giggle and Eli's small, proud smile, she whispered to herself, "This is where I'm meant to be." And though Nicholas Drake might not have believed it yet, the twins already knew. For the first time in their young lives, they had found someone who didn't walk away. Clara believed healing could never be forced. It had to be coaxed, nurtured, like a flame catching from kindling. In the days following her arrival, she began introducing her own methods. The doctors might have dismissed as unconventional, but which Clara knew reached deeper than muscles or nerves. Each morning, after breakfast, she gathered Eli and Emma in the playroom. Instead of starting with exercises, she began with songs. Her voice wasn't trained, but it carried warmth, the kind of tune that wrapped around children like a soft blanket. She clapped gently, urging them to clap along. Emma joined first, her little palms smacking together with uneven rhythm. Eli followed, hesitant, until Clara winked and exaggerated her own claps, making him laugh. From clapping, they moved into stretches, disguised as dances. Clara twirled slowly, inviting Emma to move her arms like a ballerina. She crouched low, rolling a ball across the carpet, encouraging Eli to push it back with his legs instead of his hands. Every small action became part of a story, a game that made effort feel like play. At first, the twins resisted, unused to being asked to try in ways that risked failure. But Clara's encouragement was steady, never scolding when they faltered, always celebrating even the smallest movement. When Emma's foot pushed the ball a single inch, Clara clapped as though it were a grand accomplishment. When Eli tried to lift himself on shaky legs for barely a second before collapsing into her arms, she whispered, "You're stronger than you know." The children began to lean into her energy. Their smiles grew wider, their eyes followed her with trust. For the first time in years, the mansion echoed with something other than silence. It carried laughter, hesitant but real, like a forgotten melody returning to life. Nicholas caught glimpses of this transformation in passing. He often paused by the half-open door, watching Clara kneel on the floor, her hair falling loose as she encouraged the twins to crawl toward her, inch by inch. He heard the children's laughter, saw Emma's bright eyes, Eli's determination, but each time he told himself it was temporary, false hope. He couldn't afford to believe in miracles. He had already buried too many. That afternoon, Clara placed Eli's favorite toy car at the far end of a mat. "Let's see if we can drive your car across the finish line," she said softly. "But the car needs fuel, and the fuel is your legs." Eli frowned, uncertain, but when Clara made a roaring engine sound, his lips twitched into a smile. Slowly, he pushed against the carpet with his trembling legs, dragging himself forward inch by inch. Sweat formed on his forehead, but he kept moving until his small hand grasped the car. Clara clapped in delight, and Emma joined, cheering her brother's victory. Nicola, standing unnoticed at the door, felt something twist inside him. For the first time he saw Eli striving rather than sitting in stillness. Yet instead of joy he felt fear. If he believed this progress could last, and it failed, the disappointment would crush him. He left before Clara could see the conflict on his face. Later that evening, Clara found Nicholas in the library, his usual glass of scotch in hand, his eyes fixed on papers he wasn't truly reading. She hesitated before stepping inside. "They're trying," she said quietly. Nicholas didn't look up. "Trying isn't walking." Her jaw tightened. "Trying is the first step to walking. You should have seen Eli's faith when he reached that car. He believed in himself for the first time." Nicholas set his glass down sharply. "Belief doesn't change biology. Hope is cruel, Miss Hayes. It gives children expectations that reality will only crush." Clara met his cold tone with steady resolve. "You're wrong. What's cruel is giving them everything money can buy except the one thing they need most, your presence. They need to know their father believes in them." Words struck deeper than she realized. Nicholas's eyes darkened, his jaw clenched. He dismissed her with a wave of his hand. "You overstep?" But Clara didn't retreat. "No, I care. That's what every other nanny failed to do. They managed schedules and routines, but they didn't stay long enough to see who Eli and Emma are. They're not weak. They're not broken. They're children who need love." For a long moment, the room was thick with silence. Nicholas finally turned his gaze to the fire burning in the hearth. His voice, when it came, was low. "Love didn't save their mother." Clara's heart softened at the rawness in his tone. She wanted to say more, but she saw in his eyes that he wasn't ready. So she left, quietly but firmly, refusing to take back her truth. The next morning, Clara doubled her efforts. She introduced music into their therapy, bringing in a small keyboard she had once used in her own practice. She played simple tunes, inviting the children to move with the rhythm. Emma swayed side to side, giggling. Eli tapped his toes, tiny movements but filled with intent. Clara praised every effort, weaving into every note. She also began using stories. She told them about animals who learned to walk against all odds. A bird with crooked wings, a turtle who dreamed of racing, a fox who limped but still hunted bravely. The twins listened with rapt attention, their eyes widening with the realization that strength could look different, that effort itself was heroic. By the end of the week, something remarkable happened. Emma, with Clara's hands lightly supporting her arms, managed to push herself upright for a few seconds. Her legs shook violently, but she stayed standing long enough for Eli to clap in delight. Clara's own eyes brimmed with tears. "See," she whispered, "your body remembers how to be strong." Nicholas passed the doorway just in time to see Emma fall into Clara's arms, both laughing. His chest tightened. It should have been him holding his daughter, celebrating her courage. But he stayed in the shadows, trapped with the instinct to step forward, and the fear of believing. That night, as Nicholas poured himself another drink, his mind replayed Clara's words. Love, presence, belief. He hated how they echoed in his thoughts. He hated more how right they sounded. Clara shifted their routine just enough to surprise them. After breakfast, she spread a quilt in the garden where the grass was soft and the air smelled like rain. She set jam jars along the edge like treasure markers and told the twins the game was to reach each jar and whisper a secret into it so the wind could carry their courage away and bring it back stronger. Eli laughed at the idea. Emma cupped a hand around a jar as though it were a secret. Clara settled between them and showed them how to plant their palms, how to tighten their bellies, how to draw breath low and steady. She counted softly, not like a drill sergeant, but like a lullaby said backwards. Ready, now push. Emma lifted first, not far but with intent. Eli tried next, face set with stubborn focus. When he trembled, Clara leaned closer and said, "I am here." The sentence worked like a brace. He straightened a little more. He did not stand, not yet, but he rose higher on his knees than he had ever dared. From the terrace, Nicholas stood half hidden by a column. The morning light made the scene look gentler than he felt. He watched Emma kiss the rim of a jar for luck. He watched Eli drag the quilt toward the next marker with his legs, eyes fierce, jaw clenched. A memory flickered. The first night in the hospital, when two cribs beeped in uneven harmony and he had promised a wife who could not hear him that he would keep the children safe. Success had always meant money, lawyers, walls. Watching Clara, he felt the terrible suspicion that safety also meant falling, failing, and standing to try again. He left before Clara turned her head, telling himself it was better not to interfere. He told himself progress was an illusion. He told himself anything he felt was irrelevant. The stories we tell ourselves can be louder than any truth. By midday, the twins were tired, the good kind of tired that loosened their shoulders and made their eyelids drowsy. Clara carried them inside, one at a time, careful not to make them feel small. She sat on the rug and let them lean against her while she hummed. The melody was simple, a tune she half remembered from childhood. Emma traced the pattern on Clara's sleeve. Ellie asked if the jars would keep their secrets safe at night. Always, Clara said. Secrets like that grow into wings. The next days braided themselves together into a rhythm. Morning songs, story games, races that happened in inches, not yards. Clara invented a currency called courage points. They earned 1 for every try, 2 for every try that ended in a flop, and 5 for any try that scared them, and they did anyway. The scoreboard on the wall climbed in crooked chalk lines. Emma loved drawing tiny stars beside. Eli pretended not to care and then asked, just before sleep, whether stars were worth bonus points on Fridays. The staff began to change too. The chef learned to bang a pot like a drum at the end of each session. The housekeeper set a vase of wildflowers on the piano. Even the butler softened enough to tell a joke that made Emma hiccup from laughing. The house, long a museum of polished surfaces, felt human again. Only Nicholas stayed apart. He was present in the way shadows were present, proof that light is somewhere, but not the light itself. He signed papers and took calls and paused in doorways. Sometimes his eyes softened, then hardened as though caught being kind. When Clara addressed him, he answered with the coolness of a man who believed distance was a form of protection. One afternoon, when rain penned them inside, Clara turned the hallway into a carnival. She taped paper circles to the floor like stepping stones across a river. She held both children under their arms and said they were brave explorers, crossing to a hidden island. The rule was simple: breathe, push, and touch the next circle with a toe. Emma squealed when she tapped the first one and looked back to make sure Clara had seen. Eli took longer, jaw tight, sweat beading his temple, and then he nudged the second circle and let out a sound that was more relief than joy. Clara whooped so loudly the butler smiled in spite of himself. Nicholas watched from the base of the stair. He wanted to say this kind of play would not change muscles or nerve conduction. He wanted to call a specialist and demand a measurable protocol, but then he heard Eli whisper to himself, "I can do one more," and Nicholas felt the floor tilt under him. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself it was kind, not real. Evening, Clara knocked on the study door. When he said nothing, she opened it anyway and stood with the poise of someone who had already decided not to retreat. "We need you," she said, "not as a donor, as a father." Nicholas set his pen down with deliberate calm. "What you need is more staff and clearer boundaries. I am not a prop in your performances." Are not performances. They are the beginning of faith, and faith is built person by person. They need to see you clap at the end. They need to hear you say, "Try again." He looked past her, toward the door, as if escape sat there. He was tired of grief as a daily task, tired of being told love was medicine when love had not saved the only person he had ever let inside completely. "Miss Hayes," he said, "my presence will not remake their bodies." Footnote, Clara answered, "It will remake their courage." The reply landed with the quiet weight of truth. He exhaled, the sigh almost a laugh, but not from humor, from a certain humiliation at being seen. "You talk as though you know us." "I watched them," Clara said, "and I watched you at dinner. You looked up when Eli talked about cars, your mouth softened. You think you hide it? They can feel it when you try. They reach for that softness and find air, and they learn to stop reaching." Nicholas flinched. He had spent years turning himself into marble, believing statues do not break. He wanted to end the conversation, to reassert the distance that kept his days orderly, but her words had already done their work. He said nothing. The next morning, Clara found him waiting in the playroom before the children arrived. He stood awkwardly, hands in pockets, like a guest who had come too early to a party. She did not thank him. She simply nodded, as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world, and set the jars in a line across the rug. When the twins rolled in, their faces brightened at the sight of their father. Emma reached toward him with both arms. Eli held up his car for him to see. Nicholas cleared his throat. "What is today's game?" Clara smiled. "We're teaching the wind new names." He blinked. "And how does one do that?" "By time." The gamma. Clara steadied Emma's elbows while Nicholas knelt beside Eli. The position felt foreign. He had not been on the floor with his children since they were infants. Eli's hair tickled his wrist. The boy's breath came short, fast. Nicholas said, "Lower, slower, match mine," and he breathed until Eli matched. Together they counted. Together they tried. Emma touched a jar and whispered, "I want to run to the suite." Afterward, they rested in a heap that looked like love, though no one named it. Nicholas sat with his back against the couch, while Emma leaned into his side as naturally as a tide returning to shore. He felt small and huge and very young, as though someone had moved a wall inside his chest and left a window in its place. Progress remained fragile. On some afternoons, the twins tired quickly and tears arrived without warning. On others, they flew through games like sparrows. Clara called the bad days weather and the good days weather too, and taught them that storms pass faster when you sing. At night, when the house returned to its old hush, Nicholas found himself listening for the faint thread of Clara's humming down the hall. The melody needled memory and soothed it at the same time. He would sit at his desk and stare through the study doors at the dark garden, aware of a new gravity rearranging his days. He told himself it was gratitude. He told himself it would end when the novelty wore off. He did not tell himself the truer thing, that attention can become attachment without asking permission. One last game before sleep, Clara told the children a week later. It was a simple bridge pose turned into a story about two small lions learning to roar. Eli strained, trembling. Emma squeaked a roar and collapsed into giggles. "Try again," Nicholas said quietly from the doorway. This time Eli lifted high enough that his arms shook, and his face reddened, and his smile looked like victory. Clara met Nicholas's eyes across the room. She didn't say, "I told you." She didn't say anything, but hope, once whispered, had become a language all four of them could understand. Nicholas Drake had always hated social obligations, but wealth carried its own brand of chains. Invitations came gilded in gold leaf, delivered with expectations he could not entirely refuse. His board of directors, his extended family, and his investors wanted reassurance that he still belonged among them, that grief had not stripped him of his power. When whispers began about the nanny, who seemed to be softening his household, pressure mounted. To silence rumors, Nicholas extended an invitation to Clara Hayes. He told himself it was nothing more than optics, a demonstration that his household remained respectable, his children cared for, his world intact. But when he delivered the news to Clara, his tone was clipped, almost businesslike. "You'll attend dinner with me tomorrow evening," he said, standing in the doorway of the playroom as she guided Emma through her stretching game. Clara looked up, surprised. "Dinner?" "Formal. Black tie. My family insists on appearances." His gaze flicked to the children before returning to her. "You'll be there as their caretaker, nothing more." Her chest tightened at the coldness in his delivery. She nodded, but a flicker of unease took root. She had lived in borrowed shoes before, in borrowed dignity, and she knew how fragile it felt to step into a world designed to expose her. The next evening, she stood before the mirror in the small suite upstairs. Her dress was simple, navy blue, borrowed from the housekeeper who had once worn it to her niece's wedding. Clara's hair was pinned back with trembling hands, and though she had tried to mask her nerves, the reflection staring back looked every bit as vulnerable as she felt. She whispered to herself, "For Eli and Emma," and walked downstairs. Nicola was waiting by the car, immaculate in his tailored suit, his expression unreadable. He gave her a brief nod of approval, but his eyes did not linger. For a moment, Clara thought she saw a flicker of something softer. But then it was gone, shuttered behind the cold mask he always wore in public. The dinner was hosted at the home of Nicholas's uncle, a sprawling estate lit by chandeliers and buzzing with the hum of voices that measured worth in wealth. Clara stepped into the room and felt every eye on her, the air shifting with curiosity and judgment. Women in shimmering gowns whispered behind jeweled hands. Men with polished shoes and sharper tongues assessed her with faint smirks. Nicholas introduced her in the barest of terms. "This is Clara Hayes. She cares for Eli and Emma." His tone was neutral, as though she were an accessory, a detail in his household. Clara forced a polite smile, her palms damp. The evening unfolded with practiced cruelty. Questions came masked as civilly. "And where did you say you studied, Miss Hayes?" one woman asked, her voice dripping honey that tasted like poison. Clara hesitated, aware that her education had been cut short, her path diverted by debts and family obligations. "I trained as a physical therapist for a time," she said quietly. "A time?" another man echoed, smirking. "So, not long enough to complete? How unusual." Laughter rippled at the table. Clara's cheeks burned, but she lifted her chin. "Sometimes life doesn't let us finish things the way we plan. But I learned enough to know children need more than textbooks." The words hung in the air, vulnerable and true. A silence followed, broken by someone muttering, "How quaint." Glasses clinked. Conversation flowed on, leaving her exposed in its wake. Through it all, Nicholas remained silent. He did not defend her, did not soften the sting of their barbs. He sat tall, his expression carved from stone, his loyalty directed only toward preserving his image. Clara felt each moment widen the distance between them, the gap between her fragile courage and his deliberate indifference. By the time dessert was served, her hands trembled beneath the tablecloth. She excused herself quietly, slipping out onto the balcony where the night air bit cooler than the room she had left behind. She gripped the railing, drawing shaky breaths, her chest heavy with the familiar ache of not belonging. She thought of the twins, of their laughter and whispered dreams, and wondered if she had been a fool to think she could fit in this house of marble and steel. Perhaps Nicholas's world was right. Nicola's world was right. She was nothing more than temporary, a passing comfort until he replaced her with someone more polished, someone more acceptable. When Nicholas finally found her outside, he spoke without emotion. "You shouldn't take them seriously. They feed on weakness." Clara turned to him, her eyes shining with restrained anger. "You let them mock me. You sat there and said nothing." He flinched, almost imperceptibly. "It wasn't my place," he cried. "It was exactly your place," she interrupted, her voice breaking. "If you won't stand for the people who care for your children, how can you ever stand for them?" Silence stretched between them, colder than the night air. Nicholas opened his mouth as though to speak, but the words withered before they left. Clara shook her head, stepping away from him. "Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe I don't belong in your world." When they returned to the estate later that night, Clara went directly to her room, her heart heavy with resolve. She began folding her clothes into her bag, each garment a surrender, each movement echoing the years of leaving behind places that told her she wasn't enough. Her eyes stung with tears, but she forced herself to believe that leaving now would spare her the deeper pain of being discarded later. Down the hall, the twins stirred restlessly, sensing the tension that clung to the house. Emma padded softly to Clara's door, her small hand pushing it open. "Are you leaving?" she asked, her voice trembling. Clara froze, her hands still on the fabric she was folding. Eli appeared beside his sister, his toy car clutched tightly in his fist. His eyes were wide, his face pale with fear. "You can't go," he whispered. Clara's throat tightened. She crouched down to their level, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Sweethearts, this isn't my place. I don't fit here." Emma shook her head fiercely, her voice breaking. "But you fit with us." And then, as if fate had conspired to bind her, something extraordinary happened. Emma stepped forward without Clara's support and took a shaky, wobbly step. It was brief, imperfect, and she collapsed into Clara's arms almost instantly. But it was a step. Eli gasped, his car dropping to the floor. "You did it," he shouted. Clara's heart stopped. She held Emma tightly, overwhelmed by the miracle unfolding in her arms. Eli, emboldened by his sister's courage, pushed himself up, his legs trembling beneath him, and managed a half-step forward before falling. He laughed breathlessly, eyes wide with pride. Clara clutched them both, sobbing with joy. "You're walking," she whispered, awe flooding her voice. "You're both trying." Clara could barely believe what she had seen. Eli and Emma, children whom doctors had labeled as fragile, who had been carried more often than they had ever stood, had found the courage to move on their own. It wasn't graceful, it wasn't sustained, but it was real. It was proof of everything she had fought to give them, belief in themselves. She kissed the top of Emma's head, tears dampening the little girl's hair. "See? You're braver than you think." Eli wrapped his arms around Clara's waist, as though afraid she might still disappear. His voice trembled. "Don't go, Clara, please. If you leave, we won't try anymore." The plea cut through her resolve like glass through silk. She realized then that it wasn't about belonging in Nicholas Drake's glittering world. It was about belonging in the twins' world, the one they had created with laughter, whispered secrets, and hope stitched together from her songs and games. She brushed Eli's hair back tenderly. "I'll stay, for you." When Nicholas entered the room moments later, drawn by the sound of voices, he froze at the sight before him. Clara knelt on the carpet, the twins clinging to her as though she were the only anchor they had ever known. And then his eyes caught the detail he almost couldn't believe, the slight distance between Emma's doll and her hands, the scuff mark on the rug from Eli's stumbling half-step. "End of work," Clara whispered, her voice shaking with awe. "Nicholas?" They tried. For a moment, his carefully built composure shattered. His chest rose sharply, his breath caught, and something raw flickered across his face. He stepped forward, his hand instinctively reaching for his daughter, but then he hesitated, as though afraid to touch the fragile miracle before it disappeared. "You're certain?" he asked, though his eyes had already confirmed it. Clara nodded, still cradling Emma. "They moved because they believed they could. Because they believed I wouldn't leave." Nicholas looked at her, his expression unreadable, torn between pride, disbelief, and something far more complicated. He turned away quickly, retreating into silence, but Clara caught the faint tremor in his hands before he left the room. That night, Clara stayed by the twins' bedside until they fell asleep. She smoothed Emma's hair, tucked Eli's car under his pillow, and whispered promises she had no intention of breaking. "I'm here. I'll always be here." But when she returned to her room, her own doubts returned. Nicholas had not defended her at the dinner, had not spoken when she was mocked. He had let her stand alone in front of the people who wielded wealth like weapons. Even if the twins needed her, could she survive in a world where she was considered disposable? Could she bear being invisible to the man whose opinion mattered more than she wanted to admit? Her bag remained half-packed on the bed, as though it too were caught between two choices. She sat beside it, torn in ways she hadn't expected. The next morning, Clara avoided Nicholas. She poured her energy into the children, determined to keep their hope alive. She painted stars with them, traced stepping stones across the carpet, and invented new courage games. The twins laughed, unaware of the storm churning beneath her calm smile. Linus, however, was not blind. He noticed the subtle tightness in her shoulders, the way her eyes avoided his. At breakfast, when Emma chattered excitedly about her big step, Clara smiled but did not meet his gaze. Eli repeated the story with the wide-eyed pride of a child who had discovered a new superpower, but Clara's laughter sounded hollow. Later that afternoon, Nicholas found himself in his study, staring at the unopened pile of correspondence on his desk. His family had already sent word of the dinner, thinly veiled messages of disapproval at his choice of company. They reminded him of appearances, reputation, legacy. But for the first time, he wondered if legacy mattered more than love. Clara's words echoed in his mind. "They need to see you clap. They need to hear you say, 'Try again.'" He had failed to defend her when it counted, failed to defend the person who had given his children their first glimmer of hope. He thought of Emma's shaky step, Eli's breathless laugh, and realized that hope had entered his house not because of wealth or status, but because of Clara. That evening, he lingered near the playroom door, watching. Clara knelt on the floor with the twins, her hair loose around her face, her hands steady as she guided Emma's legs through another practice step. Her voice was soft, carrying both encouragement and love. "One more try, sweetheart, just one more." Emma pushed, wobbled, and collapsed into Clara's arms. Both giggled. Eli clapped so hard his palms turned red. Nicholas felt something stir deep in his chest, a warmth he had buried for so long he had almost forgotten it existed. He stepped into the room quietly. The twins turned at once, their faces lighting up. "Papa," Clara says we can walk to the swing one day, Eli exclaimed. Nicholas froze, the words lodging in his throat. He looked at Clara, who met his gaze with a mixture of defiance and plea, as though daring him to deny the hope she had planted. Instead of dismissing it, he nodded slowly. Then, you'll try again tomorrow. The twins beamed, and Clara's eyes widened. It was a small sentence, but in it lived the first crack in the wall Nicholas had built around himself. Still, Clara's heart remained conflicted. Later that night, when she passed him in the hallway, Nicholas stopped her. His voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. They need you, more than I realized. Clara's breath caught. She wanted to believe the words, wanted to let them erase the sting of the dinner, but she knew words were not enough. They need you too, she replied softly. Then she walked away, leaving him in the shadows of his own thoughts. In his study, Nicholas poured a drink, but didn't touch it. He thought of his silence at the dinner table, of the way Clara's shoulders had squared under ridicule while he had sat unmoving. He thought of his children clinging to her, whispering for her not to leave, and for the first time in years, Nicholas Drake began to question whether his coldness had protected his family or imprisoned them. The mansion was silent after midnight, its long hallways draped in shadows, the ticking of the grandfather clock the only sound. Nicholas had been working late in his study again, papers spread before him, though he had barely read a line. His mind wandered to the image of Emma's wobbling step, to the echo of Eli's laugh. He tried to drown it in numbers and contracts, but the sound lingered like a haunting melody. At last, restless, he left his study and walked the corridor. His footsteps carried him toward the playroom, though he hadn't intended it. Perhaps it was habit, perhaps longing. He told himself he only wanted to check the locks, to ensure the house was secure, but as he neared the door, faint whispers drifted into the hall. He paused. The light inside was dim, only a small lamp casting a warm glow across the room. And there, on the carpet, Clara knelt beside Eli, her hands hovering near his arms as though ready to catch him at any moment. Eli's face was flushed with effort, his legs pressed into a tight line, his legs trembling beneath him. "Breathe, sweetheart," Clara murmured. "You're safe. I've got you." Eli pushed, groaning softly, until, miraculously, his body lifted. His knees straightened, his little body swaying precariously, but he was up. He stood for a breath, too, before collapsing back into Clara's waiting arms. She held him close, smiling through her own tears. "You did it. Ella, you stood on your own." Nicholas's chest constricted. He gripped the doorframe, unable to move, unable to speak. For a moment, the world blurred. The image of his son, standing, if only for a few seconds, was almost too much to believe. He had been told it would never happen, that the children's condition was permanent, immovable. And yet here was proof of something impossible. Clara's head turned and she caught sight of him. She did not flinch or startle. She simply looked at him, her arms still around Eli, her expression a mixture of pride and defiance, as though daring him to call it anything less than a miracle. Nicholas stepped inside slowly, his voice low, almost hoarse. He stood. Clara nodded, her hand stroking Eli's back as the boy yawned against her shoulder. He stood because he believed he could, and because I believed with him. Nicholas moved closer, his eyes fixed on his son, but his words were sharp, brittle with fear. "How long have you been doing this? These late-night Clara's gaze didn't waver. "Not experiments, encouragement. We make it a game, a secret between us. He tries harder when it feels like discovery, not duty." Nicholas swallowed hard, the sight of Eli's exhausted but proud face piercing his defenses. And what if he falls? What if he hurts himself? Clara's voice softened, but it carried conviction. Then he learns he can fall and get back up. That's the lesson he's needed all along. Love and patience are stronger than fear. For a long moment, Nicholas said nothing. He watched Eli drift into sleep, his small body limp in Clara's arms, his lips curved faintly in satisfaction. He had never seen his son look so proud, so alive. The silence between them stretched, heavy with things unspoken. At last, Clara whispered, "They've been told all their lives what they can't do. I'm telling them what they might. That's the difference." Nicholas turned toward her, his jaw tight, his eyes clouded. "You make it sound simple, but I buried their mother because I believed love was enough. It wasn't. It never is." Clara's eyes softened at the rawness in his words. She shifted, laying Eli gently on the nearby couch, covering him with a blanket. When she looked back at Nicholas, her expression held no judgment, only understanding. Losing her wasn't because you loved her, it was because life is cruel sometimes. But that doesn't mean love is useless, it means it's the only thing that makes survival bearable. Nicholas exhaled sharply, a sound caught between a laugh and a sigh. He moved to the window, staring out into the dark garden, his reflection a ghost in the glass. She was everything, my compass, my balance. And when she was gone, all I had left were two fragile children who reminded me of her every day. I couldn't protect her, I couldn't cure them, so I built walls. Clara's voice came gently from behind him. And those walls are suffocating them. They don't need perfection, Nicholas. They need you. Even broken. Especially broken. His hands clenched at his sides, the weight of her words pressing against his carefully constructed silence. Slowly, he turned back toward her. His eyes were darker than she had ever seen them, but they no longer looked like stone. They looked like a storm trying to break free. "You speak as though you know what it's like to lose everything," he said. Clara hesitated. Shadows flickered across her face, and for a moment Nicholas thought she might retreat. But then she lifted her chin, her voice quiet but steady. "I know what it's like to fail the people you love, to carry guilt so heavy it convinces you are not worthy of second chances. That's why I fight for Eli and Emma. Because they deserve a father who believes they can be more than their limit." Nicholas steadied her, searching for cracks in her conviction, for signs of falsehood. But all he saw was truth, raw and vulnerable. The air between them shifted. For the first time, the distance that had always stretched wide seemed to shrink. There was no ballroom full of mockery, no boardroom of power, no marble walls. Just two people, both scarred by loss, both clinging to hope in different ways. Eli stirred in his sleep, murmuring something unintelligible. Clara brushed the hair from his forehead, her hand tender, her smile faint. Nicholas watched her, something loosening in his chest. For the first time, he allowed himself to whisper what he had never admitted aloud. "I'm afraid?" Clara's eyes met his, unwavering. "So am I. That's why we try, anyway." Nicholas' confession lingered in the room like smoke, fragile and unexpected. The words had slipped from him before he could call them back, and now he stood with his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on Clara, as if daring her to twist his weakness into a weapon. But Clara didn't. She didn't smirk, didn't pity him, she simply nodded, her gaze soft but steady. "Fear doesn't make you weak. Pretending you don't feel it does." Nicholas blinked, the words striking deeper than he cared to admit. For years, he had lived by control, by presenting an unshakable facade. His empire respected him because he never faltered, never showed cracks. Yet here was this woman, unpolished, uninvited into his world, speaking truths that pulled down the armor he had worn for so long. He lowered himself into the chair near the couch where Eli slept, his movements slow, reluctant. His hand brushed the blanket over his son's chest, fingers lingering as though testing the reality of the moment. "I was there when she took her last breath," he said finally, his voice low and rough. "The doctors rushed around, but I knew. I saw it in her eyes before the monitors confirmed it, and all I could think was that I had failed. I had promised her a life of safety, of comfort, of health. Instead, she left me with two infants who couldn't even breathe without machine." Clara listened in silence, her own chest tightening. She sat across from him on the rug, close enough to show she wasn't leaving, far enough not to crowd him. Nicholas stared at his son, his voice breaking with the weight of memory. "I held them, one in each arm, and I swore I'd protect them. But when the diagnoses came, when every specialist said their lives would be different, I shut down. I thought if I could build walls high enough, strong enough, maybe the world wouldn't touch them. Maybe I wouldn't lose again." Clara's eyes softened. "And in the process, you shut yourself away from them." He looked up sharply, but there was no accusation in her tone, only truth. His lips pressed together, his throat working as he swallowed. For a moment, Nicholas Drake, the man who commanded boardrooms and controlled empires, looked like a child lost in a storm. "You've more than walls," Nicholas said. Clara said gently. "They need to see you believe in them. You don't have to be perfect, you just have to be here." Silence stretched between them, filled only by Eli's soft breathing. Nicholas leaned back in his chair, covering his face with one hand. "You make it sound so easy." "It is easy," Clara replied. "It's terrifying. Every day I wonder if I'm failing them. But I try anyway, because they're worth the risk. Love is always worth the risk." Nicholas dropped his hand, his gaze fixed on her. He searched her face, the quiet conviction in her eyes, the tenderness in her posture. For a moment, something stirred inside him that he hadn't felt in years, an almost unbearable pull toward warmth. He wanted to tell her that she was wrong, that love had cost him too much. He wanted to insist that distance was safer, but the words refused to form. Instead, he whispered, "I don't know how to be the father they need." Clara's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried through the silence like a promise. "Then, let me show you." The words struck him like a lifeline thrown across a chasm he hadn't known how to cross. He stared at her, searching for insincerity, but found none. Only truth, only willingness. For a long time, neither of them moved. The night pressed in around them, the mansion holding its breath. Finally, Nicholas nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but one that carried the weight of surrender. Clara rose and carefully lifted Eli into her arms, cradling him as though he were made of porcelain. She carried him upstairs, Nicola following silently behind. Together they tucked him into bed, Clara smoothing his hair, Nicola standing awkwardly at the foot of the bed as though unsure what to do. Emma stirred in her own bed, blinking sleepily at them. Clara smiled, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "Sleep, my darling." Emma's eyes shifted to her father, heavy with drowsy trust. "Papa, stay." The word froze Nicholas where he stood. For years he had been the man who kissed his children's foreheads from a distance, who sent others to soothe them when they cried. Now his daughter, half asleep, had asked him for the one thing he had never known how to give, presence. Slowly, stiffly, he moved to her bedside and sat down. Emma's small hand reached for his, curling around his fingers with squeaky strength. Nicholas's throat closed as he felt the fragile weight of her trust. He remained there until her breathing evened, her hand still holding his. Clara watched from the doorway, her heart swelling with both hope and sorrow. She saw the man he could be, the father the twins needed, but she also saw the scars that still held him back. She knew healing would not come in a single night, but in countless moments like this, moments where walls cracked and light slipped through. When at last they stepped back into the hallway, Nicholas exhaled as though he had been holding his breath for years. "I don't deserve them," he murmured. Clara shook her head gently. "No parent feels like they deserve their children. But they don't need perfection. They need love, that's all." For the first time, Nicholas didn't argue. He simply nodded, his gaze lingering on her face longer than it should have. In that look was gratitude, vulnerability, and something more fragile than either dared to name. The fragile bond had begun. Not a declaration, not a promise, but a thread of trust stretched between grief and hope. And though the night would end, though doubts would return in the light of day, both of them knew something had shifted. Clara retreated to her room, closing the door softly behind her. She leaned against it, her heart pounding. She had seen Nicholas's armor crack, seen the man buried beneath years of grief. And against her better judgment, against the walls she had built for herself, she felt her heart tremble with something she hadn't expected. The beginning of faith in him. And Nicholas, alone in the hallway, lingered outside his children's room. He stared at the closed door, his hand resting on the frame. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope. Not for empires, not for wealth, but for the chance to become the father his children already believed he could be. The morning broke with sunlight streaking across the city, but inside Drake International's towering headquarters, a different storm was brewing. Nicholas arrived to find a newspaper splayed across the glossy surface of his office desk, placed there by his assistant with nervous hands. The headline was bold, unforgiving, Billionaire, heir, caught in late-night embrace with mystery nanny. The photograph showed him standing in the playroom doorway, his expression softened in a way the public had never seen. Beside him, Clara held Eli in her arms, her smile tender and tired, a picture of intimacy stripped of its context. To the tabloids, it was a scandal too perfect to resist. Nicholas's jaw hardened as he scanned the words. The article painted Clara as an opportunist, a woman who had inserted herself into his grieving household, winning the trust of vulnerable children in order to climb into the millionaire's bed. It described her modest background, her lack of credentials, even dredged up fragments of debt from her past. By the time Nicholas reached the end, his hands had curled into fists. When the board convened that afternoon, whispers turned into accusations. One partner leaned across the table, his tone sharp. "Nicholas, you cannot allow this to stand. This woman, this nanny, she is compromising your reputation, your legacy." Another added, "Investors are nervous. They fear you've lost control, that you're vulnerable to manipulation." Nicholas listened in silence, his face unreadable, but inside a slow fury burned. They saw Clara as a threat because they had not stood in that playroom, had not heard his son's laugh or seen his daughter's trembling courage. They saw a scandal where he had seen life stirring back into his family. Still, the pressure mounted. His uncle, a man who had never hidden his disdain for sentiment, leaned back in his chair, voice cold. "End this, Nicholas. Release her. The children will adapt. They always do." Nicholas's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He adjourned the meeting with a clipped command, leaving behind a room of murmurs. Back at the estate, Clara discovered the article on her own. She sat on the edge of her bed, the paper trembling in her hands, her stomach twisting with dread. Each line felt like a dagger, not because it wasn't filled with half-truths, but because of what it could do to Nicholas, to the twins. She imagined investors pulling away, his empire cracking under the weight of scandal. She imagined being the cause of it all. When Nicholas found her there, pale and shaken, she lifted the paper with trembling fingers. "They're right. I don't belong here. I've ruined everything." He crossed the room in 2 strides, tearing the paper from her hands and tossing it aside. "They don't know you. They don't know what you've done for my children." Her eyes filled with tears. "But they see me as nothing more than a woman chasing your money, and I can't let that fall on Emma and Eli. They'll grow up with whispers about their nanny, about their father losing his judgment. I can't do that to them." Nicola's voice dropped, low and steady. "If anyone dares whisper against them, it will be me they answer to." But Clara shook her head, torn between her heart and her fear. "You can fight business partners, you can silence headlines, but you can't erase what they'll think of me. You can't stop the stares." The distance between them widened that night. Clara avoided him, her interactions with the children tinged with sadness she could not hide. Emma noticed first. She tugged at Clara's sleeve. "Why do you look like you're crying inside?" Clara knelt, hugging her tightly. "Because sometimes grown-ups forget how brave children are. Sometimes grown-ups are afraid." Eli looked up, his small fists clenched. "You're not leaving." His voice was fierce, his eyes blazing with the same determination Nicholas had seen in the playroom. Clara swallowed hard. "I don't want to, but if staying hurts your father—" "Which doesn't," Emma interrupted, her voice breaking. "It helps him. He smiles more. He looks at us more. Please don't go." That evening, Nicholas entered the playroom to find both twins clinging to Clara, their faces streaked with tears. The sight struck him harder than any boardroom insult, harder than any headline. Emma turned toward him, her words trembling. "Papa, don't let them take her." Something inside Nicholas cracked open. The steel he had built around his heart splintered under the weight of his daughter's plea. He moved forward, his voice sharp not with anger at them, but with anger at the world that dared to threaten what he loved. "No one will take her. Do you understand me? No one." The declaration startled even him. Clara stared at him, wide-eyed, her lips parting as if to protest. But before she could speak, Nicholas turned to her, his voice quieter, edged with something raw. "You've given them more than doctors, more than I ever could. I won't let them strip that away." Still, the storm outside the estate grew louder. Nicholas's family pressed harder, demanding a meeting, insisting that Clara prove her loyalty or leave. Clara stood in the center of it all, trembling, wondering if love and patience would be enough to silence a world built on suspicion. The night of the family gathering arrived, heavy with tension. Relatives, investors, and advisors filled the estate's grand hall, their voices low and sharp. Clara stood near the twins, her dress simple, her hands clasped tight to stop their trembling. She felt like prey surrounded by predators. Nicholas faced them with a cold glare, his voice cutting through the noise. "You demanded answers. Tonight, you'll have them." Clara's heart pounded, unsure of what he intended. She feared he might sacrifice her to protect his legacy, even as his eyes flickered toward her with something that looked like trust. Then Emma, sensing the weight of the moment, tugged on Clara's hand. "Show them, Clara. Show them I can try." Clara dropped to her knees, her breath catching. "Are you sure, sweetheart?" Emma nodded fiercely, her little face set with determination. So, in front of the gathered family and critics, Clara steadied Emma's hands and whispered, "Breathe. You're safe. I've got you." The room fell silent as Emma pushed, her small legs trembling. She rose, swaying, her eyes wide with both fear and wonder. For one miraculous moment, she stood on her own. Then she took a shaky step forward into Clara's arms. Gasps echoed around the room. Someone whispered, "Impossible." Eli clapped, shouting, "She walked." His voice rang with triumph, shattering the tension. Nicholas stepped forward, his voice firm, unyielding. "This is what she has done, what you all doubted. Love achieved what money and medicine alone could not. If any of you still question her place in this house, in my family, then you no longer have a place in mine." The room hung frozen after Nicholas's declaration. For years, his family and partners had seen him as an unshakable man of marble, unmoved by sentiment. Now, his voice rang with something they had never heard from him before, conviction born not of profit but of love. His uncle rose slowly, face tight with disapproval. "Nicholas, this is reckless. You cannot anchor your household, let alone your legacy, on a woman you hardly know." Nicholas turned on him with a fire that startled even the children. "I know enough. I know she believed in my children when none of you did. I know she gave them what your wealth and titles never could." Whispers stirred, but Nicholas pressed on, his tone commanding. "Emma just walked. Eli has begun to stand. If that isn't worth defending, then what do any of us stand for?" Clara's breath caught as she stood at his side, Emma still clinging to her hand. For so long she had braced for rejection, certain that, when it mattered, Nicholas would choose reputation over her. Instead, he stood like a shield, daring the world to strike at them. One of the board members cleared his throat, his voice sharp with disbelief. "This proves nothing. Children improve naturally over time. You're letting sentiment cloud judgment." Nicholas' gaze sharpened like a blade. "If sentiment is what teaches my children to fight, then I'll gladly be blinded by it, because I will never again let coldness steal their chance at life." The silence that followed was unbroken, until Eli, too small to understand the intricacies of power but wise enough to sense the weight of the moment, tugged on Nicholas's sleeve. "Papa, did I do good too?" Nicholas crouched, pulling both children into his arms, his voice softened, carrying to every corner of the hall. "You both did more than good. You showed courage, and courage is greater than any fortune." Clara's throat tightened, tears stringing her eyes. She had dreamed of the twins, believing in themselves, but she had never dared to imagine Nicholas would speak such words aloud, words that placed love above all else. His family, unsettled, shifted uneasily. A few looked away, unwilling to meet the children's bright eyes. Others muttered under their breath, already calculating the gossip that would follow, but none dared challenge Nicholas further. His voice, his presence, left no room for argument. When the crowd finally dispersed, the estate grew quiet once more. The echo of Emma's shaky step lingered like a miracle in the air. Clara carried her upstairs, whispering praise into her ear, while Nicholas followed with Eli in his arms. The children's heads rested against them, exhausted but smiling. In the hallway, Clara hesitated, her heart still racing. She looked at Nicholas, her voice uncertain. "You risked everything tonight." He met her gaze without flinching. "I risked nothing worth keeping if it meant losing what matters." Clara shook her head, struggling against the swell of emotion. "But your family, your partners." "You can leave," he interrupted. "I've built my empire before. I can build it again. But I can't rebuild my children if they lose the only person who ever made them believe." The weight of his words settled between them, too heavy, too fragile to answer. Clara turned away, guiding Emma toward her room, afraid her heart might betray her if she lingered. Later that night, as the household fell silent, Clara sat by Emma's bedside. She watched the little girl's chest rise and fall, her tiny hands curled around the edge of the blanket. Emma had taken a step, just one, but it was enough to silence a roomful of doubters. Enough to silence even Clara's own fears, if only for a moment. Her thoughts drifted to Nicholas. She had seen him tonight, not as the cold, distant millionaire, but as a father fighting tooth and nail for his children. She had also seen a man who, for the first time, chose her side openly. The realization shook her more than she wanted to admit. Down the hall, Nicholas poured himself a drink, but the amber liquid remained untouched. He stared into the glass, seeing not his reflection but Clara's face as she had knelt beside Emma, coaxing her into that miraculous step. He saw the tears shining in her eyes, not for herself, but for his daughter. He realized then how dangerous it was to let himself feel this much. Yet he could no longer deny it. Clara had changed everything. In the days that followed, whispers still swirled outside the estate. Tabloids speculated, critics sneered, investors questioned, but inside the house, hope had planted itself too deeply to be uprooted. Emma continued to practice, her steps longer, steadier each time. Eli joined her, pushing himself further, laughing louder. Clara's games became rituals of courage, rituals that Nicholas... One evening, Clara caught him standing at the doorway again, arms crossed, expression unreadable. But when Eli tumbled to the floor and Nicholas instinctively stepped forward, scooping his son up before Clara could, she knew the walls were finally crumbling. Nicholas didn't lecture about danger. He didn't pull back into silence. Instead, he whispered, "You're all right, son. Try again." Clara's heart swelled at the words, at the way Eli's eyes shone with pride. She had fought for this moment, but it was Nicholas who sealed it. That night, as she tucked the twins into bed, Emma whispered sleepily, "Papa shouted at the others so they couldn't hurt you." Clara brushed her hair back tenderly. "Yes, sweetheart? Does that mean you'll stay forever?" Clara's breath caught. She glanced at Nicholas, who stood in the doorway, watching with an intensity that made her heart tremble. He didn't answer for her. He simply waited, his eyes filled with a question he wasn't yet brave enough to ask aloud. Clara leaned down, kissing Emma's forehead. "As long as you want me to." Emma smiled, drifting into dreams. Eli mumbled something about racing cars before sleep claimed him too. Clara straightened, her hands trembling, her heart still pounding. Nicholas stepped closer, his voice low. "They'll never let you go now. And neither will I." The words hung between them, fragile but undeniable. Clara met his gaze, her lips parting in silent wonder. For the first time, she didn't feel like an outsider in his world. She felt like she belonged. The garden was damp from a passing storm, the air carrying the rich scent of wet earth. Clara spread a blanket on the grass, her voice light as she coaxed Eli and Emma into their morning game. But something in their eyes was different today. Determination glowed, brighter, bolder, as though they sensed that this morning would not be like the others. "Ready?" Clara asked, crouched low, her hands extended. Eli nodded firmly. Emma bit her lip but nodded too, her fingers tightening around Clara's. Together, with Clara's steady encouragement, they pushed. Their legs trembled, their brows furrowed in fierce concentration, and then, almost as though bound by invisible courage, both rose. For a suspended moment they stood, wide-eyed but upright. Clara's heart surged. She whispered, "One step." Emma lifted her foot, wobbling, then placed it forward. Eli followed, his breath catching in his throat. One step, then another. Clara's eyes blurred with tears as she clapped softly, urging them on. They moved like fliggling birds finding their wings, fragile but unstoppable. When they finally collapsed into her arms, giggling and breathless, Clara knew the miracle had arrived. Nicholas had been watching from the terrace. He had not intended to intrude, but the sight rooted him to the spot. His children, who had been told they might never walk, had taken their first true steps, and it was Clara, always Clara, who had led them there. His chest ached with the force of it. When Clara looked up, she saw him standing there, his eyes shining with something unguarded, something that stripped away the cold armor he had carried for years. He descended the steps slowly, as though afraid the moment might vanish if he moved too quickly. "You saw," Clara whispered, still cradling the twins. Nicholas's voice was low, breaking. "I saw everything." Clara rose to her feet, brushing damp grass from her skirt, her heart pounding. The twins still laughed breathlessly on the blanket, unaware of the storm of emotion swirling between their father and the woman who had changed their lives. Nicholas stopped, a breath away, rain beginning to fall again, soft droplets glistening in his hair. His voice shook as he said, "You've given them more than strength. You've given them a future. And you've given me something I thought I had buried with their mother." Clara's throat tightened. She shook her head, fighting the tears threatening to spill. "I don't deserve their miracle, Nicholas. I've made mistakes. I've failed before. I was never supposed to belong in this world." He stepped closer, his hand lifting as though he might touch her face, but pausing just short. "You belong here more than anyone. You are not a mistake, Clara. You are the miracle we were waiting for." The rain thickened, drumming softly against the stone terrace, soaking them in silver streaks. Nicholas finally closed the distance, his hand cupping her cheek, his eyes burning with a raw honesty she had never seen in him before. "I've built empires, but none of it mattered until now. You've given me back my children's laughter, you've given me back my heart." Clara's lips parted, trembling. "And what if I fall short? What if I can't carry what you expect of me?" Nicholas' answer came without hesitation. "Then we'll carry it together. No walls, no distance. Just us." For a moment, the world narrowed to the sound of rain and the closeness of their breath. Then, as if bound by the vow his words had created, Nicholas bent and kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of impulse, but of promise, of release, of love reborn after years of silence. When they pulled apart, Clara's tears mixed with the rain. Nicholas pressed his forehead against hers, whispering, "No more hiding. From this night forward, you are part of us." On the blanket, Emma and Eli clapped, their laughter rising above the storm, and for the first time in years, Nicholas Drake stood not as a man trapped by grief, but as a father and as a man in love. Morning light spilled across the gardens of the Drake estate, painting the trimmed hedges and rows of roses in a golden glow. For the first time in years, the grounds echoed with the kind of sound Nicholas once thought he would never hear again: children's laughter. Eli and Emma were running, really running, their small legs carrying them across the grass as though the years of struggle and silence had been nothing more than a shadow that finally lifted. Their shoes thudded against the soft earth. Their voices rose like music, and Clara watched from the veranda, her eyes shining with wonder. She had been there through each trembling step, through each moment when pain threatened to hold them back. But now, as Emma stumbled and caught herself squealing with delight, and Eli raced ahead shouting that he was the fastest, Clara could hardly breathe for joy. They were alive, thriving, and whole. And she was no longer standing at the edge of their story. She was in it, part of it, the thread that tied father and children together in ways none of them could have imagined months ago. Nicholas stood beside her, his hands in his pockets, but his eyes never left the twins. The sternness that once seemed carved into his face had softened, replaced by a quiet pride that almost humbled him. "They never used to smile like this," he murmured, his voice low, almost reverent. Clara turned her head to him. "They needed more than medicine, Nicholas. They needed love. They needed you." His gaze slid to her then, and though he said nothing, the weight of his silence spoke volumes. He had given her a place in their home, but somewhere along the way, she had taken her place in their hearts. The twins came racing back to the veranda, cheeks flushed, hair flying, their laughter spilling over like water from a fountain. "Clara, did you see?" Emma cried, her voice trembling with excitement. "I didn't fall this time." Clara knelt, gathering Emma into her arms, smoothing her hair back as tears welled in her eyes. "I saw, sweetheart. You were so brave." Eli bounced on his heels, demanding equal praise. "And I'm the fastest, right? I can beat anyone now." Nicholas crouched and ruffled his son's hair, the rare smile tugging at his lips. "You can, Eli, but it's not just about being fast. It's about being strong enough to keep going." Clara looked at him, startled by the tenderness in his tone. He wasn't just speaking to his son, he was speaking from his own heart, from the man he had been and the man he was finally allowing himself to become. As the morning rolled into afternoon, the estate seemed transformed. For years, its halls had been cold, filled with wealth but devoid of warmth. Now, the staff lingered in corners just to watch the children's laughter, to see the way Nicholas's eyes followed Clara, the way Claire's hand often brushed against his as though she belonged by his side. Word had spread quietly, and no one doubted anymore that she was more than the twins' caregiver. That evening, Clara prepared the children's dinner, her sleeves rolled up, humming softly as she stirred soup at the stove. Emma sat at the counter, drawing pictures, while Eli counted toy soldiers, arranging them into neat little rows. The kitchen glowed with homeliness, the kind Nicholas hadn't known since before tragedy had stolen the light from his world. Nicholas entered quietly, pausing at the doorway. He had seen her like this many times, but tonight something struck him deeper than before. Clara didn't just fill the space, she transformed it. Where there had once been silence, she had brought song. Where there had been fear, she had brought healing. Where there had been brokenness, she had brought healing. He walked forward slowly, the decision that had weighed on his heart for weeks finally crystallizing into clarity. Clara glanced up, offering him the same soft smile she always did, but she faltered when she saw the look in his eyes. He wasn't just watching her, he was memorizing her, as though preparing for something irreversible. After the children were tucked into bed, Nicholas asked her to join him in the garden. The night air was cool, carrying the faint perfume of roses and jasmine. Lanterns glowed softly along the pathways, casting warm circles of light on the cobblestones. Clara followed him, puzzled, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. They stopped near the fountain, where water trickled over carved stone, its sound mingling with the chirping of crickets. Nicholas turned to face her, and she could see the tension in his shoulders, though his voice was steady when he spoke. "Clara, when you first came here, I thought you were just a caretaker, someone to keep my children safe when I couldn't. I didn't realize you would be the one to save all of us." She shook her head quickly, emotion tightening her throat. "I didn't save anyone, Nicholas. All I did was love them. All I did was believe in them." "That," he said, stepping closer, "was the very thing I couldn't do. I let fear build walls around me, and you tore them down without even trying. You gave Emma and Eli their future. You gave me a reason to live again." Her lips parted, but no words came. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might break free. Nicholas reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box, and dropped to one knee. Clara gasped, covering her mouth with both hands. The sight of Nicholas Drake, the man once untouchable, unshakable, unreachable, healing before her, felt like a dream she was afraid to wake from. He opened the box, and inside, a ring gleamed in the lantern light. Not gaudy, not ostentatious, but elegant and timeless, a piece chosen not for its cost, but for its meaning. "Clara," Nicholas said, his voice trembling now, his walls stripped bare. "You walked into this house as a stranger, but you became the heart of it. Will you become the heart of it? Will you be their mother, not just in their hearts, but in every way that matters?" Tears blurred her vision. She struggled to breathe, her hands shaking as she lowered them, whispering, "Nicola, I don't know if I'm enough for this. Enough for you, enough for them." Nicholas rose, closing the distance, taking her hands in his. "You are already everything. You've been their mother from the moment they called your name in the dark. You've been mine from the moment I let you in. Say yes, Clara. Say yes to us." For a long moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The fountain sang softly, the lanterns flickered, and Clara's tears finally spilled as she nodded. "Yes, yes, Nicholas. I'll marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and before she could blink the tears away, His arms were around her, his lips finding hers in a kiss that sealed not just a promise, but a future. From one of the upstairs windows, two small faces pressed against the glass, wide-eyed with wonder. Emma clutched Eli's hand, whispering, "Does this mean she's really our mom now?" Eli grinned, his eyes shining. "Yeah, she's ours. She always was." The next morning, the estate awakened to a different kind of joy. For the first time in years, the house that had once felt like a museum, cold, grand, but lifeless, was alive with celebration. News of Nicholas and Clara's engagement spread quickly among the staff, and though decorum was always expected, smiles were exchanged in the hallways, and whispers of happiness followed Clara wherever she went. She had been the outsider, the young woman with nothing but quiet resilience and steady faith. Now, she was the center of a miracle no one had thought possible. When she walked into the breakfast room, Eli leapt from his chair and ran to her, tugging at her sleeve. "Clara, Daddy told us, you're really going to stay forever?" His eyes were wide with disbelief, as if afraid the dream might slip away if he blinked. Emma joined in, her small arms wrapping tightly around Clara's waist. "Does that mean we can call you Mom now?" she asked, in a trembling voice, one that carried years of longing. Clara froze, her throat tightening. She knelt so she could see them both, eye to eye. "Only if you want to," she whispered, her heart breaking and healing in the same breath. The twins looked at each other, a silent conversation passing between them, before they cried in unison, "Mom?" Their voices rang out, not tentative but sure, as if they had been waiting all along for the permission to speak the truth. Clara gathered them close, tears spilling unchecked. Nicholas, standing in the doorway, felt the final piece of his heart lock into place. He had thought wealth could insulate him from pain, thought control could protect him from loss, but none of it had given him what this one woman had: a family reborn. Weeks later, the garden became the stage for a small but breathtaking wedding. Nicholas had insisted it should not be about grandeur, but about meaning. The staff decorated the grounds with strings of white lights, roses in full bloom lined the aisle, and the fountain, where he had proposed, shimmered with floating candles. Clara walked toward him in a gown of simple lace, her hair falling in soft waves, her eyes locked on his as if no one else existed. The twins held her hands on either side, escorting her down the aisle, their faces glowing with pride. Nicholas felt his chest tighten as he watched them. The image was so pure, so whole, that it almost brought him to his knees again. When Clara reached him, he bent slightly, whispering to the children, "Thank you for bringing her to me." Eli grinned, Emma giggled, and Clara's hand trembled in his. The vows were spoken not in rehearsed lines, but in words born from truth. Nicholas promised to cherish not only Clara, but the family they had become. Clara, with tears shining on her lashes, promised to love them not just in joy, but in hardship. Not just when the sun was shining, but when storms came too. When they kissed, the twins clapped, loudly, shouting, "Mommy, Daddy!" And the staff, those who had seen Nicholas through his darkest days, found themselves wiping their eyes, knowing they were witnessing a rebirth that no fortune could buy. Life after that was not a fairy tale in the absence of challenges, but in the strength they found to face them together. Clara became not just the nurturer of the children, but the heart of the estate. She filled the halls with warmth, insisted the twins spend afternoons in the garden instead of behind screens, taught them to bake, to dance barefoot on the grass, to believe in possibilities greater than fear. Nicholas, once consumed by work, learned to slow down. Evenings were no longer spent buried in contracts, but reading stories aloud, his children tucked under his arms, Clara sitting close enough that their shoulders brushed. He discovered that the wealth he had built meant nothing if it wasn't used to build moments like these. Moments that no ledger could ever measure. One afternoon, as summer ripened, Clara sat under the oak tree while the twins played nearby. Nicholas lowered himself beside her, the sound of their laughter drifting on the warm breeze. She leaned against him, still sometimes astonished by how natural it felt, how the ache of loneliness that once consumed her had been replaced by belonging. "You ever think about what might have happened if we hadn't found each other?" she asked softly. Nicholas looked at her, his hand finding hers. "Every day. And every day I thank God we did. Money gave me power, Clara, but you gave me back life." You gave me a home, not just a house. You gave me love." Her eyes filled, her voice trembling. "And you gave me a place where I'm no longer invisible. You gave me a family I thought I could never deserve." He kissed her then, slow and certain, while the twins called from the distance for them to join their game. Nicholas pulled back, smiling. "Come on, Mrs. Drake. They're waiting for us." Clara laughed through her tears, rising with him, her hand secure in his. And when they reached the children, Eli and Emma grabbed her hands as though they had never known a world without her. Years later, people would still talk about the change in Nicholas. Drake, the man who had once been feared for his coldness, transformed into a father whose laughter could be heard in the gardens, a husband whose devotion was unshakable. But Nicholas himself knew the truth. It had never been money that saved them. It had been Clara, the woman who walked into his life with nothing but love to give, and in doing so gave him everything. On a quiet evening, after the twins had fallen asleep, Nicholas stood at their bedroom door, watching them breathe peacefully in their dreams. Clara joined him, resting her head on his shoulder. Together they gazed at the children who had once struggled to take their first steps, now running freely toward a future that glowed bright. Nicholas whispered, his voice thick with gratitude. "This is what I was searching for all my life, Clara. Not empires, not wealth, just this. Just us." Clara slipped her arms around him, her reply simple but profound. "And now you'll never be alone again." In that moment, Nicholas understood the truth he had resisted for so long. Money could build walls, but love built bridges. Wealth could purchase security, but love gave meaning. And Clara, his Clara, was the miracle that had turned loss into life, despair into hope, and loneliness into a family reborn. The garden wind rustled gently, carrying the echoes of children's laughter, of promises spoken beneath stars, of hearts finally made whole. And as Nicholas drew Clara closer, he knew that no fortune, no empire, no legacy would ever matter more than the one she had given him. Love that endured, and a family that would last forever.